two things happen when the film starts. One is that we're immediately confronted with the Holocaust and Auschwitz, and the other is that whether we're consciously picking up on it or not, we're responding to your filmic approach, the style where we're so, when we pick up the character of Saul, how close a companion we become to him. Do you have any thoughts about the way viewers and critics are responding to that experience?
The experience of the opening?
Yes. Or of the or of your filmic approach?
Well, making this film was a very intuitive process, and but the objective was very conscious. The objective, my aim was to immerse the viewer in the situation of one individual in the camp. So it had to be a very organic process. We wanted to rely on the imagination of the viewer to have an intuition, a sort of mental perspective of the infinite suffering taking place in a concentration camp. So I had my objectives. I knew what I wanted to achieve, and then I discovered the reactions. So I know that the first image is that already was in my first short film. That's how I opened it. You know, out of a blur comes to focus a human figure. Is a way to establish the situation and the world in which we're going to live in as viewers, and talk and establish the limitations immediately for the viewer and the main character.
Mm. There's also to that approach, you've called your film an ambitious film carried out in an economical manner, and there's a somewhat of a practical approach there too, of not having to create the epic scale, I suppose, but to, as you say, rely on the imagination of the viewer, which is, of course, usually worse, probably. The horror in your mind, the way you imagine it, is worse than if you were to depict it in some ways. But I'm curious about how much was there on the set. You have to have a certain amount because the camera might pick it up, but on the other hand, the cinematographer is skillfully keeping a sort of limited view of what we see. So what was the set like for, say, like the showers sequence?
First you mentioned a few sentences or a sentence of my directorial note before I made this film. So it's very revealing, you know, that the strategy was clear from the beginning. It had to be ambitious, it had to be economical, but also it's restrictive, it's narrow in its vision. But one shouldn't be confused. We didn't make this film that way because we didn't have enough money.
Right.
We made this film that way because we wanted to enhance the viewing experience, which is partly a mental process, and we want to reaffirm the power of the mental process in viewing the film. So in this case, we knew that it was an ethical question. Do we want to show everything and tell everything and represent everything as it's been the case in the so-called Holocaust films, or and thereby making everything understandable, or do we want to hint at the infinity of the human suffering taking place, and that you can only achieve by narrowing your point of view and actually taking the viewer inside the process, and it has to become a personal experience because the viewer has to project so much. So we had to build for that. I mean, we had to have sets, and we had to have props and extras and everything. Although we knew that we didn't have to recreate everything, this approach allowed us to make this film in the framework of a restricted budget. But it looked pretty real, and as the interior and the exterior are connected, that the levels of the main set, that is the crematorium, are interconnected. In this way we had a continuity of spaces, interconnected spaces, so that allowed us to be immersed in this world, and also for the viewer to believe it more. It's an organic feeling, and the fact that the cast and crew had to perform these complicated, continued, developed takes.
And so much of it unfolds.
That made everybody believe that we were in a real place.
Yeah, as I say too, it enables you to have a lot of it unfold in real time.
Yes.
Right. So you mentioned the infinity of suffering, human suffering, and this film, we get a particular human who we focus in on and we follow on the journey, and he's of course in this situation of extreme duress on his humanity, an almost unimaginable duress. He's kind of crawled into himself in some respect, but then we get this moment of change in him with the boy that takes him on this journey of the film, right? Can you talk about developing his manner at the outset of the story, and maybe your understanding of how he develops over the course of that journey?
Well, this was an infernal situation, but each and every individual responded to it, in some way similarly, in some way different. There was no any like a monolithic, way to respond to it. And from the script, from the very few lines Saul has, I kind of felt that Saul is a lonely character. There's people in such a dangerous, gravely dangerous situations. They rely on each other. It seemed to me, from the script, from the beginning, that Saul is on his own. He has one friend, Abraham, in the movie, but that friendship is deteriorating. It kind of falls apart as the plot unfolds. So my understanding is that these people are in the process of dissolution. They're gradually disappearing. They live their lives in an extremely mechanical, robotic way. And then something happens right in the 5th minutes of the movie. This encounter takes place. This boy, around 14, survives the gas chamber. And by simply surviving the gas chamber, he beats the system. So, in a place when Saul and all the other Zoneco members are so depersonalized, desensitized, that so numbed to death, all of this sudden there is one death that stands out from all the other deaths. Almost like a sign or a miracle, if you may. So why is this boy, why does he survive, and why does he have to be murdered a second time by the Nazi doctor? So witnessing this kind of evokes, resurrects a shred of humanity in Saul. He's again connected with himself. He feels something, having done that for a long time. So in this way, he's in debt. He owes the boy one, because he again kind of in a pilot flame level, just in a very minimal way, but he's alive, he feels something. So, out of gratitude, what else good can you do for a dead person besides burying him? Now, I'm not saying that this is a thought process. This, he came to this conclusion with his whole being. But once his mind is set on this, it becomes an obsession. He's maniac after this pursuit, and I think that gives him purpose, and I think that makes him, if I want to sound pathetic, God's last witness, because the rest of the gang is interested to save their skins, to get the hell out of here, which is fine, it's legitimate. But basically it states that there is nothing higher than survival. And if you look at Saul's behavior, it's pretty clear that what he's saying, the premise of this whole, crazy, impractical attempt of trying to bury this boy, is that there is something higher or more than survival, which is of course arguable.
Right.
We don't sanctify his behavior. I think it's left for the viewer to struggle and wrestle with this question.
And it sort of mirrors, or maybe even encapsulates, the question of the Sonderkommando, that the moral question of do we prioritize human survival or human dignity, I suppose, in a way. Though from our seats here, it's impossible for us to judge.
Absolutely. There's been a tendency in the post-war period to put blame on the victims, and people asking why Jews went to the gas chambers, and why they didn't do this and that, but from the armchair it's an entirely different experience. But when you're in this process, it's also a different experience, and I wanted to talk about that, how different the situation was from what we can imagine now, and what the films, the so-called Holocaust cinema, try to establish for the viewers.
You want to say something? No, yeah. I'm just, I think it's pretty clear that we all have a breaking point. Peter, you have a breaking point. I have a breaking point.
Yeah.
You have a breaking point. And so I think at this point it's so sad, but throughout this terrible, historical cases or genocides or whatever, we know people, wrote and told us their accounts of how impossible really when you're brought to that, close to that breaking point. I don't know how genuine is the choice that we are left with. So I think that most of us would have done as they were.
Going back to the topic of the boy, I imagine that for you as the actor, you mentioned his single-mindedness with his pursuit, that it was important to fully believe that the boy is Saul's son, which he says, though I don't know if there was also a process there of him having to actively believe it. And then I wonder for László as the director and co-writer, what your take on that was. In a way, it doesn't really matter all that much if he's literally his son or not, but would you care to address that at all, from your differing perspectives?
The idea of revealing a final solution. Well, that's not the right word, I guess. But really a solution for the viewer. We didn't want that. We just had to make it a journey, and that's a journey for the viewer. The viewer has to decide whether, whether it makes sense to try to do what Saul tries to do, whether this voice within can exist and in this kind of situation, whether it's important if it's his son or not his son. So it has to become. These are questions for the viewers, and I'm not reluctant to have the viewer decide. And I think that was the most important. Although we had in previous versions of the script more clear-cut answers to that. Not entirely clear-cut, but more. We wanted to preserve this as Saul's secret in a way. So that's what I think.
Well, as an adopted person, I can just testify to what we call mind over matter or bond over genes, or I do believe it's his son, but he becomes his son when they meet there. It's not, this is not a biological relationship, but he is his son.
So, Géza, how important has performance been in your life? You were in an underground punk band, you were a film actor in the past, a poet, and now an actor again. Has that always been an important part of your identity, or is it something that keeps just kind of finding you?
Well, Peter, I'm an amazingly multi-layered person. I can't do anything.
And a novelist now, right? Yeah.
Well, hopefully my novel is not ready yet. But I would say that, I'm like a volcano and have lots of holes on my mountain, but it's the same lava that is coming out of these holes. I don't think when I perform or sing or write, I think that the human condition, the individual's human condition is such that you're born into a particular body and a set of sensibilities and all that. So this sounds more interesting than it is, that someone is singing and performing and writing. It all comes from the same place. And it wasn't calculated, but I would love if there would be a script, because I've been waiting long for someone to be able to address the Holocaust in a movie, and I've grown tired and uncomfortable with the so-called Holocaust movies. So when I read László's script, I was blown away. I felt that this is it. This movie has to be made. So if I would, again, by the grace of God, come across a script that is similarly, essential and important, and I would feel that it's a fit for me, I would love to act, sure.
So maybe I should go all the way back a little bit to the Scrolls of Auschwitz. That was the origin of the project, is that correct? Finding those published and reading that book.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what those contain, or what that book contains?
Well, I think it's an essential read. The Scrolls of Auschwitz are text written by the members of the Sonderkommando of Auschwitz-Birkenau. So the members of the crematoria of Auschwitz wanted to leave a trace. They knew they would be exterminated. They wanted still to leave a trace of the extermination of their people. And these are incredible accounts that transport the reader to the here and now of the extermination. And also in contrast with a lot of things that have been written or novels written after the war, they are an immediate experience. And that's why I was attracted to that so much. It's not a post-war point of view. It is from within, and they never made it to the canons of the Holocaust literature in a way. They're ignored.
Just beyond the notion of to never forget, the will to remember and educate, in what other ways is the Holocaust still with us in 2015, do you think?
In many ways. First, Europe hasn't come to terms with the extermination of the Jews, with the destruction of the European Jewish civilization. And you can feel it in a very strong way. And anti-Semitism has not disappeared, even with the destruction of the Jews. So it's there. And then also, I think as a human civilization, we are still not aware of the full potential of self-destruction and destruction within the most sophisticated forms of human civilizations. So we can turn away from that evil, but that will be a dangerous future. And I think you can see that, genocides have been happening since Auschwitz, and still as we speak, people are being exterminated, and nobody does anything.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just for me, everyone else has a different journey, but Auschwitz called everything into question, and for that was my kind of awakening, to realize that how defenseless is reason and decency in the face of moral nihilism. And the demonic, the human evil, if you may, is not a dummy. It excels both in science and technology. It did with the Nazis, and we can look around in today's world. These people are out there, and none of us is immunized against hatred or bigotry or racism or any of that. It's not just around us, it's in us. And that is why the mornings are so important, because you can't really ruin your day if your morning is done well. So I think that's what I not that lots of terrorists will watch this interview, but if I could send them a message, it's just prioritize well your morning. Don't put your tie on in the elevator, and don't be in a taxi 20 minutes after getting out of your bed. But just take your time. If you don't pray, then find your own way of meditation. But if you sit down for a half hour every day in the morning, and you think, just think, then it will be it would be a much better history.
I guess I'll end on a lighter note here with a question about the sort of mood on the set when you make a film of such weight. There's a sort of conventional wisdom that when actors and directors are working on a drama, that there's a kind of gallows humor, whereas if you're working on a comedy, it's deadly serious. Was that at all the case making this film? When the cameras stopped rolling, was there ever a kind of breath you could take, or were you maybe different for you than for László? Yeah.
I mean, Freud wrote an essay on why or how is that the persecuted people, persecuted nations have a great sense of humor, and the reason simply is because they're so powerless, and they are facing such a overwhelming oppressor, so they can't obviously just uprise. They have no tools or skills to do that. So at least they can laugh at them. So I think that Jewish people in general are laughers, eaters, laughers. There's a couple of characteristics like that. You know, it's a safe bet to say that there was plenty of humor, not so much during the shooting, before and after. And even nowadays, when we are promoting the movie, I'm not going to bore you with some of our stupidest lines, but we laugh a whole lot.
Yeah, well, while making this film, I had the impression that I was failing miserably. And that was a very, very strong feeling, and I would go and see the cinematographer after each take, and the editor or my co-writer. I would say, hey, that's it. Any final thought on me? You know? And it was very strong throughout the film, throughout post-production. I guess that's the way it is. I didn't go and make jokes with him on the shoot, but because I couldn't. I mean, it would have disturbed our relationship. But I had to go and see my, cinematographer and whisper something to his ear or something. So it had to be done. But I think you're right about that rule. It might be true.
All right. Well, I have to stop there. It's been a great pleasure talking to you both.